Hey everybody, for our board work this week, we're just going to be breaking down the perfect competition graphs. I know there's a lot of lecture material out there, but sometimes it's good to just have somebody go through it so that you can see how it works. So basically what we have here is what you would call long-run equilibrium. And you have these side-by-side graphs. You have the industry graph and you have the firm graph. And so basically what that means is this is, hundreds and hundreds of firms in an industry. So if this is the milk industry or the beef industry, this represents just a normal supply and demand graph of all the perfectly competitive firms together, right? Corn, soybeans, whatever. And this is an individual producer, and they face a different set of costs, etc. So remember, the whole idea is that these firms don't have any choice other than to take the market price. They don't have any market power. They don't have any way to make people think that their product is somehow different than the other products. It's just buying a bushel of corn, buying the soybeans in mass quantities that go into our food, etc. So they take this market price and you move it directly over. It's not two separate curves, it's sort of one entity, and it becomes this thing that we called in the lecture the Mr. Dark curve. It's all the marginal revenue, it's the demand curve, it's the average revenue curve, and it's also the price, all at the same time, right? Price. So this is long-run equilibrium because you can see that at the profit maximizing quantity, where MR equals MC, okay, they're going to produce that much quantity, and they're going to make no economic profit because the revenue is going to equal their costs, right? Price times quantity, this box is revenue. Average total cost times quantity is the same box. So remember, we call that normal profit, meaning they go through their production, they can pay all their workers, they can put their kids through college, they can cover all of the costs that they would have had in any other job, but they're not making any additional profit, right? They cover all of their opportunity costs. So let's manipulate this a little bit. So let's say, for example, that the demand for this, the demand for corn or the demand for soybeans increases. Okay? So what happens is this gives us a new market price. And these firms get a new Mr. Dark curve, which we'll call Mr. Dark 1. Now, the firms still make the same decision. They produce where MR equals MC. Okay, so now each firm is going to be producing a little bit more. Okay, they produce where MR equals MC. These are their costs, and so this whole box becomes profit. Okay, and so now you have to understand, well, what happens in the long run? Well, in the long run, other firms in this, well, it doesn't matter whether they're in the industry or not, they will see these excessive, not excessive, but economic profits above normal profits, and they will say, hey, I want to get into that industry, there's money to be made there. And so all of a sudden, more firms will come into this industry. Why? Because there's no barrier to entry, and you will have an increase in supply, which will, if you notice what's happened, you had an increase in demand and an increase in supply. It brings the price back down to long-run equilibrium. All of that profit is sort of taken away by these new firms, and you're back at long-run equilibrium. Quantity goes back to the original quantity, right? It's now spread out among more firms, but what you do notice is that first, more quantity was being produced, and now even more quantity is being produced. So this item, whether it's corn, beef, or or soybeans, the demand is being met and there's a lot more quantity being sold and produced. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. And what you notice is that it's sort of like a self-correcting model where whenever there's profit, more firms will enter. And now let's take a look at a different scenario where there's a loss so that you can see what might happen. So here, what I've set up is the same industry and firm. Okay. But in this situation, what you should notice is it looks a little different, right? It's not long-run equilibrium. Now the ATC is above the Mr. Darp curve, and so that is a firm experiencing a loss. So let's see what happens there. This firm is going to produce where MR equals MC. So it's going to produce that quantity. So the firm is going to produce this quantity for the firm, but at that quantity, the average total cost is up here, and so they are experiencing a loss. Okay, they are experiencing a loss at that amount. Well, what perfect competition tells us is that there's ease of entry and exit. So firms in the industry are going to start looking at those losses, and they're going to start questioning their ability to stay in the industry. Now, I should just notice that I did not put an average variable cost curve on there. You can assume that since these firms are still producing, that the average variable cost is somewhere below that, meaning that they're still getting enough income to cover their variable costs. But firms see those losses, and they are going to begin to exit the industry. Okay? And so what that does is it increases to a new price and a new Mr. Darp that is, for all intents and purposes, long-run equilibrium. Okay? And when they're at long-run equilibrium, firms shouldn't enter or leave until something outside of this industry begins to affect it, either demand or supply changes in some particular way. So hopefully that sort of just gives you an idea of how the graphs work so that you can work through your application problems and figure it out. And if you have any questions, of course, please contact me.